Good evening, and welcome to our tales of Samhain, the time when the veil between the two worlds is at its thinnest, and the spirits are said to walk the earth. My name is Beverly Bryant, and this is Heather Yule with our beautiful Clarsach. And tonight we're going to entertain you with stories, Scottish stories in the main, stories that have come from the traveller folk and from the ancient stories of Scotland. And each one of them reveals something new about this time of year. Now, we might be used to weddings in summer, but that wasn't always the case. In fact, in Scotland, with so much farming going on, it was at this time of year and in the winter time that many weddings took place, when things were quieter and people could devote themselves to the celebrations. Did you know that there's a reason why bridesmaids all wear the same dress? It's so that nobody can steal the bride, no one from the spirit world, as they walk to the church. Well, our young couple were madly in love, and they had so looked forward to their wedding day. Of course, weddings took place in the village where you grew up, where you lived, and the bridal party would walk to the churchyard. And after the ceremony, they would walk back and the trestle tables would be filled with gifts of food and drink from all the other villagers. And the groom's party? Well, the groom's party arrived early. And as he walked through the street, he would gather all the young men from the village and they would walk with him to be there first at the church. Well, the day had dawned bright and clear. And the groom was early because he was so nervous. So when he reached the groom's party and they walked through the village to the edge of the graveside with its wall built up all around the edge, he was far too early. And the young men teased him and they laughed at him and he said, "Look, just give me a minute to myself. I need some time." And although they teased him about that too, he walked off to the edge of the boundary wall of the cemetery. And there, standing, was a tall man in a tall hat and a long cloak. A man that the young bridegroom did not recognise. But it was his wedding day, and he was happy, and he would greet anyone, stranger or no. And when the stranger leaned forward and said to him, "I have something to ask of you," well, the young man was delighted because this too was something that happened on your wedding day. You did as people asked you to do. "Well," he said, "I'm to be married soon, but if there's any way I can help you just now, then of course." And the tall man, he put his hand deep into the deep pockets of his coat and he drew out, well, really it was just the stub of a candle. It wouldn't have lasted long. And he placed it in his palm and he held it out to the bridegroom and he said, "I'd like you to hold on to this for as long as it burns." Well, thought the bridegroom, on your wedding day you must do as people ask you to do, and he was early and it wouldn't take any length of time for this candle to burn out. "Of course," he said, and he took it from the stranger's hand, and the candle was lit. And the young man watched the candle as its flame flickered and the wax began to pool. And he looked at it as it burned down. It would only take a moment or two. And he thought of his bride. And he thought of the beautiful little purple flowers that he gathered from the hedgerow for her, and how pleased she would be. And then the candle flickered out. Well, he thought that was an easy thing to do, and he turned to look for the man, but there was no one. He walked along the edge of the boundary wall of the cemetery, and he shouted for the young men, and there was nothing. No sound, no movement, no laughter. He walked in to the churchyard, and he realised that the leaves were still on the path. They hadn't been swept away. In fact, there, in amongst the gravestones, he could see a gardener sweeping now. But surely this should all have been cleared before his wedding. He went over to the gardener. "Excuse me," he said, but the guests, the wedding, what's happened?" Well, the old gardener turned and he looked at the young man, and he leant on the brush. "Wedding?" he said. "Lad, there's been no wedding here for many years." "But there must be. It's now. The guests should be here." "No," said the old man. "Well, the last wedding that was to take place here, well," he said, "it was my father's father that told me about it. Aye, it was a strange one, all right," he said. "It seems the groom never showed up. And the poor lass, she waited and she waited. It seems she waited her whole life, but he didn't come back." The young man was crestfallen, and he followed the movement of the old gardener as the old gardener brushed the fallen autumn leaves from the front of a gravestone. And there, the young man saw, carved in the gravestone, little flowers, hedgerow flowers, and he knew. "But it's me," he called out, "it's me!" And he reached his hand, and as his hand touched the gravestone, the young man turned to ashes in the time it takes to blow out a candle.
Now, this is a story that took place a long time ago in the northeast of Scotland. And it's a story that I heard as a child from the teller Stanley Robertson, one of the travelling people, master storyteller, and one of my favourites of his. And This story is about a man called Rob Ha. And Rob Ha was a traveller lad, and he did travel the roads, going from place to place, doing bits and pieces of work, and sometimes he travelled with friends and family, but quite often he liked to be on his own. And he had a wee route that he would take across the country, and people would expect him. They would know that Rob Ha would be coming soon, and they would save up wee jobs for him. And this particular day, late morning, he arrived at this town, and it was one of these places that he had been to every year for many years. And he had a favourite place to camp. It was down by the river, just outside of the town, along one of the main roads. There was a beautiful grassy spot just beside the river. And so he went there, he got himself settled, and then he decided he would head into town to get a few supplies. So he walked along the main road, and there on the left was the cemetery, the graveyard, and then soon after that he came to the edge of the town. He got his few bits and pieces and he was making his way along the streets when he heard a shout, "Rob Ha! Rob Ha!" And he turned to look, and there across the road was Mr. James, the undertaker, that he knew quite well. And Mr. James was gesturing wildly and he came rushing over. He said, "Rob Ha, just the man I need to see. I have a job that I need doing today. It's really important it gets done today, and it's a two-man job. Do you not have apprentices for that kind of thing?" said Rob Ha. Oh, yes, said Mr. James, but they're away on their holidays. And it's just myself today, and I really need your help. Well, Rob Ha was a bit reluctant. I mean, he'd helped Mr. James before, but, dealing with dead bodies wasn't really his favourite thing to do. And he was about to refuse when Mr. James said, "I'll pay you a lot of money." And he named quite a big sum of money. Rob Hobb hesitated. He said, all right, I'll help you out this time, since seeing that you're stuck. And so they made their way through the town. And Rob Ha didn't know where he was going. He was just following Mr. James' lead, and they went through the town, and then they started out of the town up a big hill. Rob Ha stopped. He said, "Wait a minute. The only house on this road is the big house, the laird's house. And I've heard tales of that laird. I've heard that he's a laird of the black arts, the dark arts. I've heard terrible stories of him. I'm not going there." "Oh, for goodness sake," said Mr. James. "You don't believe in such nonsense as that. Magic and black arts and all sorts of things like that. I can't believe that you think anything of that. Look, you don't have to worry, because it's the laird himself who's dead. He's who we're going to sort out. Can't harm you now." "All right then," said Rob Ha, and once again Mr. James reminded him of how much he was going to be paid. Okay. So away they went. But Rob Ha was uneasy. And that uneasiness grew as he walked and as he approached that big house. Oh, it was an ominous looking lump of stone there. There was something brooding and ugly about that house. And as they stepped into the doorway, into the hall, oh, the shivers that went up and down Rob Ha's back. I mean, it was dark in there, and the place just felt like it was full of evil. And they stepped into the hallway, and there was a little bit of light. You could see sort of very odd-looking paintings in strange, twisted forms in the shadows. And then, out of the darkness, came a wee sliver of light, because it was the housekeeper with a candle. "This way," she said. She turned and they followed her. And they went into the house, deeper and deeper into the house. And she led them up creaking stairways and along narrow, dark corridors until they came to the bedchamber of the laird. And what a sight met their eyes, because there was the laird in his own bed, sitting bolt upright. He had died sitting up, and his arms were outstretched with his fingers kind of clawing at the air, and his face was all twisted. It was as if he had been screaming and shouting when he died. Well, I tell you, it was a terrible time they had. There was the coffin lying open beside the bed, and they had to get the body into that coffin. And two of them manhandled this corpse out of the bed, and they tried to fit him into that coffin, but they couldn't. They had to, in the end, they had to break every single bone in his body to get him to lie flat. The laird was still staring up at them with his wide eyes. Rob Ha went down and just lowered the eyelids. But when he stood up, the eyelids opened again, and there were those eyes still staring up at him. They had to leave him like that. They put the coffin lid on, they screwed it down tight. And Mr. James said, well then, that's all we need to do. Others will come and collect the coffin, and tonight he'll be buried in the cemetery. So off they went. Oh, I tell you, Rob Ha was so glad to get out of that house into the fresh air, and he was walking as fast as he could back down the hill, with Mr. James almost running beside him. And when they got back to the town, Mr. James says, Rob Ha, come along to the workshop later on this afternoon, and I will give you the money that I owe you. And Rob Ha thankfully parted company with the undertaker, and he went off to his camp to get himself a very strong cup of tea by the fire, and just to try and get those images of that laird out of his mind. And later on that day, he went back into town, and he found the undertaker's house, and it was over above the workshop where the coffins were made. And as he approached the place, he saw two young lads standing outside. They were the apprentices. They were Mr. James's apprentices. And Rob Ha said to them, what are you doing here? I thought you were on holiday. And they looked at him and shook their heads. No, we're not on holiday. But why did I have to go and do that job today? Why did I have to go to the laird's house? Oh, they laughed. There's no way we were going to go up there. We weren't going to go anywhere near that laird. You couldn't pay us enough money to touch that old man. Well, said Rob Ha, it was just awful. It was horrendous. And he told the young lads about the state of the corpse. And one of them said, well, you know that he died swearing and shouting at Mr. James. He was threatening to kill him. Why would he want to kill Mr. James? Said Rob Ha. Ah, well, you see, while you've been away this past year, Rob, there was a lassie that came to the town from another village, and she was looking for work, and the only work she found was at the big house. And the laird took a fancy to her. She was a bonny looking lass. And Mr. James got awfully worried about her because she was a good Christian lassie, brought up properly, and he just thought it was dangerous for her to be living and working in that house. So he gave her some money, they put her on a train and sent her off to get a job somewhere else. And I tell you, that laird was so angry. He was absolutely livid. And he threatened Mr. James, and he said he was going to kill him for what he did. But he died before he could. Well, that explains it. says Rob Pa. Well, Rob Pa went inside, found Mr. James, got his money, and away he went back to his camp. That night, he was tucked up in his bed, nice and cosy, in his blankets, and he was fast asleep. And it was in the middle of the night, the wee hours, as we'd say, of the night, when all of a sudden, Rob Pa woke up. He thought he heard his name being called. But he lay there in his bed, listening. There was nothing. A dream, he thought. He curled up into his blankets, into the warmth, and closed his eyes. And just then he heard, "Rapa! Rapa! Help!" He sat up in bed, sure that he heard somebody shouting his name. He got out of bed, he went over to the door of the tent and he peered out. It was thick fog outside, he couldn't see a thing. And he listened, and sure enough, there came again, "Rapa! Rapa! Help! Oh, goodness, somebody's out there." Now, lots of people saw him that day, so people would know that he was back at the village, back in the town, and everyone knew where he camped. Somebody must be out there needing help, and they were shouting for him. He grabbed his coat, he put it on, and out into the night he went. And he stood there listening to that voice, trying to work out where it was coming from. He couldn't see anything, barely see his own hand in front of his face. Sounded like it was coming from the direction of town, so he started along the road, kind of very gingerly, trying to sort of see and feel his way and listening intently. And there he heard it again. "Rapa! Help! Help!" He'd come along till he was right beside the graveyard, the cemetery. The gate was open and the voice was coming from inside there. He thought, "Oh, somebody's wandered in this thick fog and they've hurt themselves." And so, without even thinking twice, he stepped through that gate. And the instant that he did, a shudder went through him. And he stopped dead still. He straightened up. And he turned. And he started to walk very confidently, very steadily down the road towards the town. Now, if you'd seen his face at that moment, you wouldn't know what to think. For there was no expression now on his face. It was very still, and his eyes had gone completely black. And he marched into town. Mr. James was fast asleep when suddenly he was woken by the sound of somebody downstairs in the workshop. Wasn't unusual to hear somebody coming into the workshop and start to walk up the stairs, because back in those days there weren't so many doctors, there weren't many hospitals. You know, if somebody died, you would call the undertaker to come to help from as soon as somebody had died. And so he was often woken up in the middle of the night. So he was beginning to sit up in bed. He was lighting his candle beside his bed when the door burst open. And there, standing in the doorway, was Rob Pa. "Rob Pa," he said, "what are you doing here, man? What's going on? What's wrong?" "What's wrong with you? You look really strange." The figure stood there, staring at him, and then it spoke. It wasn't Rob Pa's voice. "I'm not Rob Pa. I'm the laird, and I've come back to take my revenge on you. And what is even better, even sweeter, is that Rob Ha will hang for your murder. And the figure, the shape, had the most hideous, malicious grin, and the eyes were glittering from across the room. And Mr. James saw that he had in his hand a chisel, a narrow chisel from the workshop down below. And he knew that it was one of his chisels. He recognised it, and he knew it would be razor sharp. Well, Mr. James leapt out of bed and looking around wildly. I mean, he was a youngish, fit man, strong man, but he had nothing to defend himself with. He was in his nightshirt, for goodness sake. He had a candle and he had a chair, and that was it. Well, that figure, that creature, came across the room at him, and the battle began, and I tell you, it was a fight. And they went from one end of the room to the other, crashing against the walls. And Mr. James tried his best, but I mean, Rob Ha was superhuman in his strength, and it didn't take long before Mr. James was pinned up against the wall with only a small piece of that chair left between him and Rob Ha, and that chisel ready to be plunged into him. And then suddenly, Rob Ha shuddered, and he fell to the ground unconscious. The chisel rolled across the floor. Mr. James sank down the wall and huddled there on the floor, shaking. I don't know, maybe 20 minutes later, he saw Rob Ha start to move and groan. Mr. James grabbed that chisel and he edged over along the wall to the door, still shaking, not sure what was going to happen next. Rob Ha sort of sat up, kind of shook himself. His eyes now were hazel, and he looked very confused and puzzled at where he found himself. What's going on? He said, what am I doing here? And what's wrong with you, Mr. James? Why have you got a chisel, and what is it? What's happened? You tried to kill me, said Mr. James. Why would I do that? Said Rob Ha. How did I get here? And the two of them were still trying to work this out. About half an hour later, when there was a sound of feet on the stairs running, and the door burst open, and there was a wee laddie panting from his run. I said, Mr. James, you've got to come quick. Odd Maggie's died up the glen. That you're needed. You must come. Ah, said Rob Ha. That's what happened. Maggie is now the keeper of the graves. What are you talking about? Said Mr. James. And Rob Ha explained, for you see, amongst the travelling people of Scotland, and a lot of the country folk as well, in the past they believed that when a person died in a parish, their soul didn't leave this earth immediately. They became what is known as the keeper of the graves, and they stayed on earth for a while until the next person passed away. And so the laird's soul had the power to still use his black arts to try and carry out his revenge against Mr. James. But just in time, odd Maggie died, and her soul took over, and the laird was banished from this earth and could no longer do his evil things. And so that is the story of Rob Ha.
It's not only the travellers, of course, who walked the paths, the hills and the roads of Scotland. It was also the musicians. Musicians could make their money travelling from fair to fair, from place to place, town to town, from wedding to christening to harvest time and celebrations. And our harper, well, he was in demand. And he would play in one village and bring them the news, and then he would take his harp and he would pack it on his back and he would carry on across the hillsides to the next location. And at times of the year he was expected in one place or another, and he knew that there would be a warm welcome for him, a seat by the fire, good food, and a wee dram of the water of life, the Ushka Bay. And so it was that he found himself in a small hamlet away up in Perthshire. And he entertained the people all through that afternoon, and when the sun set, they lit the fires and he played on. But then, eventually, he stopped. "Well, folks," he said, "I must be going." "Oh, you can't leave now. Goodness me, it's far too late. Oh, you'll get lost on the hills. Lad, the darkness has fallen." "Oh," he said, "well, I stayed a bit longer than I'd meant to, but I know these roads. I travel them every year, and I have somewhere to be on the far side of the hills tomorrow." And the harper, he could not be dissuaded. And he packed his harp and his belongings and he put it on his back and he set off out of town and up the hill path and across the ridge. But then, as so often happens in Scotland, down came the fog. And the fog was so thick that he couldn't see in front of him. He didn't know how close he was to the edge of the path or to the edge of a cliff. He didn't know which direction he was going. At one point, he came to an overhanging rock. What to do? He could curry in under the overhang and maybe just stay warm until the morning. But it was cold and stopping was a danger, and he had a place to be, and what should he do? He kept on walking. He walked for another, must have been half an hour, until he came to an overhanging rock, and he realised he'd walked in a circle. Well, this time he sat down and he put his back against the rock and he lifted his harp. He couldn't find the sticks to make a fire and he could feel the cold, and he thought, I don't know if I'm going to make it through this night. But, he thought, if I am to die this night, then I'll die as I lived, and I will play for the joy of it. And he began to play his harp in the darkness and in the fog, and the music carried out of the cave and across the hillside. And the harper amused himself by playing tune after tune. And then, suddenly, out there, in the fog, he saw something. Two eyes looked at him. One green, one blue. And then, as he looked around him, from out of the fog came other sets of eyes, and he realised it was wolves. Wolves. What could he do? He had nothing else. He was caught in this cave. What would he do? And he thought, well, if I'm to die this night, then I'll die doing what I love. And he played, and he played. And it seemed that as long as he played, the wolves surrounding him simply watched. But in the cold, in the fog and freezing air, you could only play for so long. And eventually the harper knew that his fingers were stiffening and he wouldn't be able to play any longer. And so, accepting his fate, he laid aside his harp and he looked out, and sure enough, those two pinpoints, those eyes, came closer, one step at a time. The others stayed where they were, and soon he could make out the shape of the wolf. But its gait was unusual. As it came forward, he realised that it was holding one of its paws, and as it came to him, it turned its paw upright, and he could see the barb of a blackthorn sticking in the pad of its foot. It must have been causing it so much pain. And our harper, before he could even think what he was doing, he had reached forward and he took the barb and he pulled it. And the wolf put down its paw and it looked into the harper's eyes with its one blue eye and its one green eye. And it seemed almost as if it nodded. And then it turned and it padded away back into the fog. And he saw the other pinpricks of light turn and follow their leader. Saved. Harper lay back against the rock and he took what sleep he could once the adrenaline had stopped flowing through him. And soon it was light. And soon he realised that he was only a few feet from the path that he knew so well. And so he lifted the harp onto his back, and with the morning light, off he went. And he went on his way to the next town. And the next, and the next, through christenings and weddings and feasts and fairs. He travelled. And a year and a day passed, and he found himself at the fair once again, where he was always welcomed amongst all the other musicians and market traders. The place was so busy, everyone wrapped up against the cold, and the harper cheered by the thought of a warm drink and a seat by the fire as he played. He carried his harp on his back, and as he made his way through the throng of people in the market square, he was bumped all of a sudden by someone. And turning, he looked into the face of a man with a cowled hood. "Well met, harper," the man said. And the harper looked. And looking up, he looked straight into the man's eyes. One blue eye and one green eye. And the man put out his hand to shake the harper's. And as the harper reached out his own hand, he saw the scar across the man's palm. And the stranger shook his hand and he said, "Well met, harper, and thanks are due to you, because it took someone to step up and to meet their fears so that I could be free." And with that, the man turned and he disappeared into the crowd before the harper could draw breath.
was told by Stanley Robertson, and it's one that I've known most of my life, and I love this story. It comes from a part of Aberdeenshire by Ballater, down on the south side of the River Dee. And there was a traveller family that lived there a long time ago by the name of Maggie and Davy Stewart. And they had a caravan called the Evening Star, and it was a remarkable caravan because it was unusual in Scotland to have a wooden caravan like theirs. It was carved and painted beautifully in bright colours with the name Evening Star written on it. And when you saw it in the distance, you knew that it was Davy and Maggie's caravan. And they travelled the roads, going from place to place, as the travellers did back then, working for different farmers, getting odd jobs here and there, selling their wares, etc. But they had one campground that they thought of as home, the place that they ended up most, and that was Ballater, the lovely town of Ballater. Now, this particular summer, when this story happened, their son was about 14 years old. And this lad, he had been brought up on the road, and he was very comfortable going round the houses, doing odd jobs for people and selling the things that he and his father and his mother had made. And this particular day, he had gone off on his own round the houses. And he had spent a long day travelling from here to there. This was when people lived quite scattered around the countryside, and so it took quite a long time to go from one house to the other. And so it was late afternoon before he set back towards home, towards Ballater, where the caravan was at that time. He was tired, but happy. It had been a good day, but as he was walking along, he realised that the weather had changed, and the clouds had gathered, and it had gotten quite cold. The wind was beginning to blow, and it was one of those cold winds that went straight through you. And then it started to rain, and it was miserable out there. And he only had a thin coat, and he was trying his best to walk faster, but he knew he still had a long way to go. So he thought he would go along the main road, because maybe, just maybe, somebody would come along with a cart or something and give him a lift to Ballater. So he was walking along the road, and the weather was getting worse, and the rain was getting fiercer, and he had his head bent down into the wind, when all of a sudden he heard the sound, the very welcome sound of wheels. And he looked back down the road, but it was a big fancy carriage, magnificent carriage, coach being driven by these beautiful black horses. And he thought, they're not going to stop for the likes of me. So he stepped off the road to give the coach room to get past, and just was waiting for it to go past. But what do you know? It stopped. And there, the seat behind the horses, was the driver, of course. And he was wearing one of these long black capes that they wore. And he had what we call in Scotland a lum hat, which is a very tall, thin hat, like a chimney. And he looked down at the lad and he smiled and said, laddie, would you like a lift? Where are you off to? And the lad said, well, I'm headed for Ballater. The driver, well, I'm off to Ballater too. I have to make some stops on the way. I have to make a few wee detours. But if you don't mind that, you're very welcome to have a seat up here beside me, and I'll give you a lift. Well, the laddie didn't mind at all. He was just glad to get a chance to get off of that road. And up there on the seat, it wasn't enclosed, but those old coaches, they had a wee roof over the coachman's head, and so it kept the worst of the weather off of you. And of course it was kind of cosy, there were blankets, and so he just got himself settled, and off they went. And in minutes, he and that coachman were blethering away like they were old friends. They were chatting away, they were having stories, and they were laughing and having a great time. They went up this road, they came to a house, and out of the house came an old man. and he got into the coach. Now, the laddie did think the old man was dressed rather strangely. It looked like he was wearing what only could be described as a nightshirt. He thought that was a bit odd, but he didn't think too much of it. But the other thing that he thought was strange was there was a wee window there so that the coachman could look inside at his passengers. And the laddie had glanced in that window when the old man got into the coach, and there was another passenger there. And he thought it was odd that the two passengers didn't speak to each other, they didn't greet each other. On they went. They came to another house. A woman came out, and again she had this sort of funny sort of long gown, flowing gown on, and no coat. And she got into the coach, and once again when he looked, the passengers didn't greet each other. On they went. And they were coming up this very long lane, and the coachman said, right, this is actually the last stop, lads, before we head straight for Ballater. But we're a wee bit early, so I hope you don't mind if I'll go inside and I'll be as quick as I can, and then we'll be off. Fine, said the lad. They got to the next house, the coachman disappeared inside. The weather had gotten a wee bit better, but all of a sudden the wind got stronger and the rain started to sweep round, and he was being soaked. He was getting absolutely soaked, and he was suddenly really cold sitting there outside the coach. And so the lad thought, okay, I'll just go inside with the passengers for just a few minutes, just to keep out of this rain. I'm sure nobody will mind. He went round and into the cabin of the coach and got in and said, oh, it's a terrible day, is it not, with all this rain? Nobody said anything. They all just sat. They were all staring straight ahead. I was thinking, they're awfully queer folk here. He tried again, I hope you don't mind me joining you, getting out of the rain. No one even turned to look at him. And then he sort of looked at one of the faces and he realised that the eyes were staring straight ahead. He thought, oh, I don't like these folk. I'm out here, I don't care about the rain. And he was out of that coach. But it was awful outside, and he went over to the wall of the house. There was really sort of steep roof that stuck out quite a bit, so he could get a wee bit of shelter under the eaves. So he was huddled against the wall. There was a window beside him, and he looked and he could see inside a bedroom. There was a bed with an old man in it, an old woman sitting beside the bed, and a minister with a Bible. And as he watched, he saw the minister close the Bible that he'd been reading from, and then lay a gentle hand on the old woman's shoulder. I'm sorry, Mary, John's gone. And the woman started to cry. And just at that moment, the door of the bedroom opened and the coachman came in. The old man sat up in the bed. The coachman beckoned. The old man got out of the bed and followed the coachman out of the room. The old woman and the minister didn't seem to notice any of this. And at that instant, the laddie knew who he had been sitting beside all this time. It was the angel of death. He didn't know what to think. He started, I was just absolutely horrified. What was he going to do? He didn't know what to do. He was so scared that he just ran back to the coach, clambered up and sat down on the seat. The door of the house opened. Out came the old man, followed by the coachman. The old man got into the carriage. The coachman jumped up in the seat beside the lad. I said, all right, laddie, that's us away to Ballater now. And away they went down the road. Well, the lad could hardly speak. I mean, he was just sitting there, just so scared. The coachman just blathered away, just like he had done before. When they got towards Ballater, the lad needed to actually get to the other side of Ballater where the camp was, but when they got to the first part of Ballater, he said, "Oh, this will do me fine." He just wanted to get away from there as fast as he could. "Are you sure, laddie?" I am sure. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it." The coach was stopped. He clambered off. And the coachman looked at him. He said, "Oh, laddie, you know, this has been such a pleasure. It's not very often I have somebody to talk to on my rounds. And it's been a right pleasure. And I'll see you again one day. Another day you'll get a hurl on my coach." And the laddie was thinking to himself, "Oh, I hope it's a long, long time from now." And I don't know why he did this, but as the coach started to move away, he shouted up, "Where are you headed?" in Ballater. And as the coach moved and over through the rumble of the wheels and the clop of the horse's hooves, he heard the answer, "I'm off to the Evening Star." And away went that coach. The laddie couldn't believe it. The Evening Star. It was his parents' caravan. He started to run like he had never run in his life before, through Ballater as fast as he could. He knew he couldn't get there before the coach, but he tried. Oh, did he try? And he ran, and he ran. And as he got close to the camp, he saw, to his horror, that there were flames and smoke leaping up into the sky, and lots of people had gathered. He pushed and shoved his way through these people, and he came into the camp, and there was the Evening Star, ablaze with flames. And he stood there, shaking and sobbing, when he heard his name being called, and he looked over, and there was his mother and his father running through the people towards him. Well, there were hugs, there was tears of joy. I said, "But I don't understand." And he told them about the angel of death coming to the caravan. "Ah, laddie," said his father, "I have a sad thing I need to tell you. For you see, we weren't in that caravan today, but your dog Prince was. Maybe that's who the angel of death had come for."